Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. You know, one of the most underestimated threats in a grid down situation is fire prevention and fire suppression. As preppers and survivalists, we all learn how to start fires in the most challenging of conditions. However, if you're like me, when you first started prepping, you found yourself with a $1,000 bug out bag and no fire extinguisher in the house. When the grid goes down, fire departments and emergency services are likely to be very overwhelmed, if they're even functioning at all. It's very likely that massive conflagrations are going to sweep through densely populated urban areas, and you need to be prepared to deal with that kind of situation. Years ago, I made a video called The Fires of SHTF. But I wanted to revisit the topic considering the events that are unfolding right now in Ukraine. Their grid is being decimated by Russian bombardments, and as such they don't have access to running water, heat, and electricity. This means that people are relying on their own means and devices to keep themselves warm. This has elevated the fire risk. According to an article recently put out by the CBC, Ukraine's State Emergency Service said that 9 people had been killed in fires in the past 24 hours alone, just a couple days before filming this video. People are breaking safety rules trying to heat their homes following Russian attacks on power facilities. The number of fires has risen, with Ukrainians increasingly resorting to using emergency generators, candles, and gas cylinders in their home due to the power outages. For example, in the last day, there were 131 fires in Ukraine. 106 of them were in the residential sector. 9 people died, 8 were injured. Generators on balconies, gas cylinders in apartments, lit candles, barbecues, due to the violations of fire safety rules, which is understandable when you're in a life or death situation, and the use of uncertified products for heating and cooking. The incidents of fires and explosions in high-rise and private buildings have become far more frequent. This is likely only going to continue to get worse as we descend into the winter months. This is of particular importance where I live, where people are going to be using whatever means they can muster to keep themselves warm. Let's talk about some of the risk factors in a grid-down post-disaster environment when it comes to fire. The first and foremost is going to be that the grid is likely going to be down. That means that any smoke alarms, sprinkler systems may not be working unless they have their own independent power supply. Also, as we previously indicated, emergency services are likely going to be overwhelmed and not able to come to the rescue or extinguish the fire. Even in the best of times, there are certain fires which simply are unmanageable for firefighters. People are going to be trying to cook their food in their homes by using alternate means, whether that's a propane stove, a kerosene stove, perhaps they're running a generator in the house, or they're just actually using natural materials, possibly even a wood stove. These are all viable methods to cook food, but it means that the risk factor is going to be elevated. People are also going to be using the same types of fuel sources in order to keep themselves warm. And when people are cold and freezing, they will do just about anything to keep warm, which is totally understandable. Unfortunately, when people become hypothermic, they tend to not be thinking as clearly, and thus the potential for error is high. Another thing you're going to have to worry about post-collapse would be arson. You would think that in a dire situation like that, it would take a very deranged individual in order to commit acts of arson. But it's very likely that there is going to be those types of people around who, just for kicks, are going to be lighting fires knowing that emergency services are not going to be there to suppress them. You're also going to have the prospect of rioting, and we've seen that throughout the United States in 2020, where rioters, whether intentional or not, would light fires, and these fires would spread because emergency services were not able to enter these areas. So the risk of fire in densely populated urban areas, whether intentional or not, is extremely high post-collapse, and you need to have a plan in order to deal with it. One of the problems in Ukraine right now is that there's artillery shelling, and with this shelling comes explosions and comes fire. So if you do find yourself in an embattled war zone, then that is something that you're likely going to have to deal with also. If this situation does, heaven forbid, go nuclear, then fire is going to be commonplace. With respect to people not having the discipline to utilize fire as they did in days gone by, I would encourage you to go and watch one of those old-fashioned videos where there were no traffic lights, just at the turn of the 20th century. And you had trolleys, you had horses, you had people walking, people on bikes, and you even had a few cars, and they were all sharing the same road with no traffic laws. And surprisingly, it organically flowed very well, and there were very few accidents. The modern day person's brain is not wired to navigate that type of chaotic environment where we become so accustomed to rules. And the same thing is going to apply with fire discipline. People just simply don't have it, which is why you need to be very defensive and on the lookout when it comes to fire safety post-collapse. Another thing to consider is that electromagnetic pulses that are caused by high-altitude nuclear weapons, which would be the case if we actually descended into a World War III type situation, that in itself is going to cause a lot of fire because you're going to have major power surges. And that in itself is likely going to cause a lot of fires that are far away from any sort of nuclear blast zone. So how then do we manage the risk of fire? Well, there's many ways to mitigate the threat. First and foremost is strategic relocation. If at all possible, try to avoid living in densely populated regions. Of course, this is not going to be a reality that a lot of people are going to be able to do immediately. Therefore, you're going to be left with what you got. The first thing is to have a fire escape plan. Know the fire escape routes. Now, this seems pretty simple, but I'm guessing that there's a lot of people who've never actually looked at the fire escape diagrams in their apartment complexes or in their office buildings. If you live in a simple building where there's, one or two ways in and one or two ways out, that's fine. But if you work in a more densely populated building, then you definitely should have an escape plan. Of course, one of the most useful tools in fighting fire is just a standard fire extinguisher. I'm not a firefighter. We do know some firefighters, and one of the main things that they recommend is that you always make sure that you point the fire extinguisher at the base of the fire. So you don't want to be targeting the fire itself or the smoke coming off of it. You want to make sure that you're actually suppressing the fuel that's combusting, and that means that you have to point it at the source of the fire. We're likely in the future going to get one of my firefighting friends on here to give us a few more tips on this issue. Other thing you consider are things like fire blankets. Fire blankets are designed to extinguish incipient fires. You can use them to smother the flames, starve the oxygen, and extinguish them before it gets out of control. They can work as a protective heat barrier when escaping a fire. Just cover yourself with a fire blanket and run to a safe place. Fire blankets also work on any type of fire. There's also this contraption called a fireball. We've done tests on these before. Basically, it has the same ingredients that a fire extinguisher does, and when you throw it into a fire, it explodes, and ideally, it's supposed to suppress the fire. Of course, this is going to have varying results. One of the great things with this, though, is to set it and forget it solution. There's a 15-year shelf life on them, so people will get these in various designs, and they'll put them in high-risk areas of their home. That way, if a fire emerges, it will trigger this device, which will explode, and it will spread the fire suppressant chemical everywhere, and hopefully it's going to put out the fire. It certainly shouldn't be relied on, but it's one of those things that it's better than nothing. Now, it should go without saying that you should have smoke detectors in your home that run on their own power source. These are going to be exceptionally important in a lights out situation. You might also want to consider a carbon monoxide meter. This is one that I purchased for my winter hot tent, but it's definitely something that we have in our home. Also, you can get these in a variety of different sizes. This is just a portable one. In terms of fire escape tools, you can get things like this escape ladder from the Kitty Company, and they can extend, I believe, about 25 feet. So if you live on a higher floor, then that's something you can consider. If you really wanted to splurge, you can get these things called fire escape backpacks, where you put the backpack on and it acts like a harness, and I believe it has a very long length of rope from which, of course, you would anchor to some place in your building. Now, of course, that's only for very serious situations, and ideally you wouldn't want to resort to that because, of course, there is room for human error there, unfortunately. But you can actually get those fire escape backpacks, and if you live in a high-rise building and that's your only option at this point, that's something you may want to consider. In terms of avoiding asphyxiation, you could look at things like gas masks, like this 3M or these mirror safety gas masks. A simple particulate filter is going to work just fine to make sure that you don't inhale the smoke. The other thing that you might want to consider is carbon monoxide. You could get carbon monoxide filters before. Unfortunately, we can't get them anymore because they came from Russia. And of course, everybody knew what happened with that situation. But for the most part, you're likely going to be dealing with smoke inhalation, the inhalation of chemicals. As such, a standard activated carbon filter with a particulate filter would work for that purpose. You can also buy something called a smoke hood, which is specifically designed to filter out smoke and carbon monoxide. Typically, these things are throwaway, so they're single use. So these are just some ideas for you to consider. And in terms of making fire indoors and keeping yourself warm indoors, we've talked about a variety of different ways that you can heat your home. You can go check out some of our videos that talk about winter survival gear. We go over a variety of those different things. In terms of candles, just making sure that you're using candles that have a flat surface, that aren't at risk of toppling over. Survival candles like this work great. Or you could even get yourself UCO lantern, which contains the fire, and that's going to allow you to use this for illumination. In terms of cooking, there's plenty of very safe isobutane cooking options on the market that we've talked about on the channel before. And of course, if you're out in the wilderness, there's other methods as well. Now, one thing I forgot to mention with respect to fire risk is a lot of people think that if I'm out in the country, the risk of fire is going to be relatively low. And that might be true unless you live in a forested region. In 2017, there was a prepper in Utah who made this series of bunkers under the ground, and he had all of his stash spread across 6 to 8 bunkers. And unfortunately, his cabin and a lot of his bunkers were impacted by this forest fire that spread through there. So this is one more thing to keep in mind, is that wildfire suppression is not going to be there in the case of a post-disaster environment. And because our current way of doing things has been to suppress fires in fire-prone regions as soon as they arise, the risk of wildfire in a post-disaster world is going to be much higher than it is now. So if you live in a wooded region, it's very important that you try to clear as much of that flammable brush or trees away from your home as possible, and make sure that you have alternate evacuation routes if need be. Let me know how prepared you are to deal with this situation should it arise, and let me know if you have any fire suppressant ideas. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Canadian Prepper out.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.